So today we have a very special guest visiting from the White House Historical Association. Our original plan for today's program started out with some sort of an idea of Christmas in July, because their 2019 official White House Christmas ornament honors President Eisenhower, and it symbolizes his commitment to innovation. If you haven't noticed, they are for sale in the gift shop. It's a wonderful ornament of Eisenhower's helicopter, because he was the first president to fly on a helicopter. This program quickly grew beyond Christmas in July when we discovered a little bit more about our special guest. Lindsay Chervinsky, I said it wrong, didn't I? No, that's right. Okay, is a historian with the White House Historical Association. She received her Ph.D. from the University of California, Davis, and she has a book coming out next spring titled The Cabinet, George Washington and the Creation of an American Institution. Please help me welcome Lindsay to Abilene.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for that warm welcome. This is my first time to Kansas, so it's a fantastic reason to come visit and to be here. Now you might be asking, what is someone who wrote a book about Washington doing to come talk about Eisenhower? And it is my great joy as a historian at the White House Historical Association to be able to talk about the presidency at large, and I think that that position allows me to sort of take an eagle's eye view of how the institution, how the White House, and how the people that lived in the White House have evolved and changed and shaped both the place that they lived and American society and culture more broadly. So it's from that perspective that I'm coming here to talk to you about Eisenhower today. And my guess is that because you're all here, you know a fair amount about Eisenhower, or at least are quite interested. And so it may be that some of the little bits and the stories that I'm going to share with you, you already know, but I'm hoping I can bring a new perspective to how I see Eisenhower and how I see his presidency. And I'm very much looking forward to your questions at the end as well. So I'd like to start with a little story about Eisenhower. That's one of my favorite stories, and I think it illustrates beautifully why he was the right man for the moment in the 1950s. So it was early 1955. The United States had been having a great deal of tension with communist China and, of course, the Soviet Union, and Eisenhower was getting ready to do one of his weekly press conferences. He was quite religious about his weekly press conferences. They always took place on the same day. He thought it was very important that the American people had the opportunity to see him and to hear from him. It was important to have that transparency and that accountability. And right before he was getting ready to go in front of the podium, one of his aides pulled him aside and said, we're getting some information about this missile issue and we don't have answers yet. And so this question could potentially be embarrassing. And if it comes up, we would like you to just not answer it or say that the National Security Council will answer it or end the press conference. And Eisenhower said, no, it's fine. I got it. Don't worry about it. Goes to do his press conference. Sure enough, about halfway through, he gets this question. And he starts to answer, and he doesn't make sense. And I don't mean that he wasn't being factual or that he wasn't answering the question. I mean, he actually wasn't really speaking English. His verbs weren't matching his nouns, his conjugations were all wrong, and his aides started to be concerned, like, is he having a health problem? Is he having a stroke? What is going on? Like, he doesn't sound right. The press didn't really ask any follow-up questions, because how do you ask follow-up questions to something that doesn't make sense? And he finished the press conference, he gets down off the podium, and his aides go, are you okay? Can we help you? Like, what was that? And he goes, let the Soviets try and translate that. And I love that story because, first of all, it's hilarious. It shows, the inner workings of the man. But it also shows a couple of really key moments, key themes about Eisenhower that I want to touch on for the next few minutes. First, his war experience shaped who he was, of course, obviously. He had seen the very worst that humanity could offer, and it allowed him to not take things too seriously. He knew when something was actually a crisis, and he knew when something could be dealt with humor or with subterfuge or with some sort of other method. He knew when to be stressed and when not to be stressed. So that allowed him to have an edge up on foreign policy. An edge up on foreign policy. It allowed him to bring his war experience to domestic policy in a way that we don't always anticipate. It made him a very detailed and diligent leader, which we haven't always seen in the White House. And it encouraged him to embrace innovation and technology. So I'm going to go through each four of those: foreign policy, war experience, detailed leadership, and innovation and technology. This is a picture of, it's not the White House press conference, but it is a White House press conference, just to kind of give you the vibe of what it would have looked like at the time. So in terms of foreign policy, when Eisenhower was first appointed the commander of the Allied forces, he arrived in London in early 1942 with a nearly impossible task. He was supposed to come up with a strategy, and he had to get American forces, British forces, and French forces to all agree to a strategy while fighting the Nazis and dealing with the international press. And I'm sure, as many of you can guess, generals and politicians don't tend to have small egos. So this was a challenge for him because they all had different ideas about what they should be doing and how they should be going about attacking the war effort. And Eisenhower really wanted to go first for France. And the British forces really wanted to go into the Mediterranean, they wanted to go into Italy, and they wanted to go into Africa. And eventually Eisenhower actually had to compromise and said, okay, we'll do that first, and then we will go into France. And then he was in charge of creating a strategy for a plan that he didn't initially support. And so that required a lot of compromise, it required a lot of subtlety, it required a lot of negotiation and stubbornness occasionally to ensure that he was doing something that he felt he'd be best prepared to do. And there was a quote in the New York Times that said that he had mastered the art of being jovially outspoken without saying much of anything. And I think that was the perfect tactic. He had to be friendly. He had to make sure that people got along with him. He had to make sure that people liked him, but he couldn't necessarily lay all of his cards on the table. And as a master poker player, he took those skills into the battlefield and he took those skills into the presidency. So one of the things that was so important that Eisenhower learned during the war was how to be a master planner, how to use strategy, how to husband power and amass resources, and fight from a position of overwhelming strength. And that sort of principle was something that he brought to foreign policy and he brought to domestic policy. And the other key piece was that he relied on the friendships that he had built during the war. So many of the people that Eisenhower was negotiating with, was dealing with on a day-to-day basis, Churchill is just one example, he was in office once Eisenhower was president. So those relationships that had been forged were really critical. And just to give a few examples of how Eisenhower used this strategy and used these relationships to try and negotiate foreign policy. One example is he refused to continue the war in Korea. He knew that it was a losing battle, there was nothing to be further gained, and so he insisted upon ending hostilities. He avoided sending ground troops to Vietnam. He would not get into a war on the ground in Indochina. That was not something he was willing to do, even when all of his closest advisors were encouraging him to do so. He deterred China's military advances in Taiwan, and this is an example where Eisenhower knew that the stakes in Taiwan were different than the stakes in Vietnam, and so he was willing to go to different lengths to try and achieve those goals. And he actually did a fair amount of nuclear saber rattling, threatening people, threatening to use the biggest weapons at his disposal, knowing that it was important in this instance. And finally, when Britain and France planned to invade the Suez Canal in 1956, Eisenhower really leaned on those relationships to force them to back off, to force them to withdraw troops, and even went so far as to refuse to give oil or loans of dollars until they complied with his strategy, even if it meant almost crippling the British economy, because he was willing to take those big steps if it was necessary to achieve his goals. This is one of my favorite pictures. It's of Eisenhower planning the D-Day strategy right before the troops were sent in. I just think it is a great example of the sort of leadership that we saw sort of in the day-to-day with his troops that he then brought into foreign policy as well. So as I mentioned with the war experience, Eisenhower had really seen the very worst of what could happen from war. And so he had a very different perspective than a lot of other politicians. This is an example of him touring Poland after the end of the war and seeing the destruction and the damage that it caused. And when you've seen things like this, I think that I'm not speaking from personal experience because I haven't fought war, but he said that having been in war, it was the very last thing he ever wanted to have happen again. And so it was very formative in what he was trying to accomplish with his domestic policy. That being said, the war also shaped who Eisenhower was as a person and how he approached any sort of decision making. He was incredibly disciplined. He was incredibly hierarchical with how he viewed the world. He was a military man, so these characteristics should not really come as a surprise for those of you that know the military world. He believed in order and the rule of law and following the rules. He believed that the legal system in the United States had to be defended and had to be protected and had to be followed. And so that perspective very much shaped his approach to one of the most challenging domestic crises that he faced as president, and that was the battle over civil rights and segregation of schools, which culminated in the Little Rock Nine and him calling out the National Guard. So civil rights is one of those issues that for as many historians as there are in the world, there are perspectives on how Eisenhower handled the Civil War issue. In some ways, he was, some of his contemporaries saw him as very radical. He was pushing the issue. He was very supportive. In some ways, his contemporaries saw him as not doing enough, not taking enough of a moral stand, maybe making the right decisions in the long run, but not doing enough to morally push the issue. So for example, just a few examples on both sides. When the Montgomery bus boycott was taking place and there was great violence that was occurring against the leaders of the civil rights movement, Eisenhower never said anything about it. He didn't speak out against the violence, and a lot of people were really offended by that. On the other hand, knowing that Brown versus Board of Education was going to be coming before the Supreme Court, he appointed a very moderate California justice, Chief Justice Warren, probably knowing how he was going to rule on that decision. And he did not speak out against the decision. He did not in any way seem to challenge Warren's decision. So that was seen as a big sign of support. But as the tensions over Brown versus Board of Education grew and as they were exacerbated and as the students were trying to integrate the school in the Little Rock Nine, it became clear that some sort of action was going to need to take place if the schools were actually going to be integrated. And eventually, Eisenhower's position was that mob rule could not be allowed to overrule the judicial system. It just could not. And Governor Faubus could not be allowed to challenge the Supreme Court in that way. And so Eisenhower made the decision that something had to be done, and if he was going to take action, it was not going to be small action. I think this goes back to his military experience. If he was going to enforce the law, he was going to darn well make sure he did it completely. And so he called up units of the 101st Airborne, he nationalized the Federal Guard, and he sent them into the schools with the students, which at the time we now see as a major stepping point for civil rights, but he did receive a lot of pushback for this decision. And so I think his military experience really informs how he went about broaching this challenge. One last little political element of this moment that I think is really important to take into consideration is that nowadays in politics, sometimes when the use of military comes up, we accuse politicians of referring to military issues to make themselves look strong on a particular issue. That's, a challenge that's sort of levied back and forth on both sides. No one was going to accuse Eisenhower of needing to use the military to look strong. That was just not going to happen. And so I think that he had some flexibility to call up the Air Force and to use the National Guard in a way that maybe some other presidents wouldn't, because he did have this extensive military experience. So when I was first telling the story about the press conference, I said that Eisenhower knew when not to take things too seriously. And this is a feature that as we study Eisenhower's life in the White House, we see really come to the front. He put in 8-10-hour days in the Oval Office, but then he knew when to take a break. And he knew when to spend time with family. He knew when to take a vacation, when to rest. He loved having his family and his grandchildren in the White House. There's some great pictures of his children riding bikes out on the south lawn of the White House. There's some great pictures of them having Christmas parties. So he constantly was asking his children to come stay at the White House and to bring their children so that his family would surround him. The White House gardens are also a perfect place to play golf. And so he would occasionally, in a tense moment, if he needed to think something through, he would go out and take his wedge and he would work on his wedge shot. Or he would go out and he would take his iron and work on his iron shot. And it was the perfect way to kind of disconnect from the challenges of office. While still, of course, these issues weighed on him, they gave him an opportunity to take a moment and reconnect with what was really important. So one of the things that mystifies me is that a couple of years after Eisenhower left office, one of those polls were done about, what is the best president? What are your top 5 presidents? We as Americans, we love these polls. We do them constantly. Historians battle over who should be where. And a couple of years after Eisenhower left office, he ranked towards the bottom in between Chester Arthur and Andrew Johnson, which is yeah, exactly. That's crazy. And I think one of the reasons that initially people had this conception about him was that he intentionally cultivated an air of aloofness, of distance, of delegating most issues to his aides. And so scholars initially really took that at face value when perhaps that was a more political decision or a foreign policy decision. But as more and more records have become available, as they've become declassified, we've actually seen how incredibly detail-oriented Eisenhower was, how incredibly focused he was. I mentioned his weekly press conferences. He also had weekly meetings with leaders of Congress. He had weekly meetings with his cabinet. He had weekly meetings with members of the National Security Council, and he did not miss them. They were structured. They were a very important part of the schedule. And so that detailed leadership, again, goes back to this sort of military mindset of needing to know how to delegate and what to delegate, but also then to be able to supervise and have the details. And I think the proof was really in the pudding. When Kennedy came into office, he was expecting his meeting with Eisenhower to really blow Eisenhower out of the water. He had been studying his briefing books for months, and he was ready to, school the old man. And he came into his office, and Eisenhower basically gave him a 2-hour masterclass on all of the foreign policy issues, on all of the domestic issues, who he had to work with, what relationships he had to cultivate. And Kennedy was really blown away by Eisenhower's handling of the issues, handling of the data, his understanding of intelligence, and his ability to speak to all these issues in a broad and yet also detailed way. And it was because of his attention to the details and what he had in front of him. So this is a picture of him with one of his closest aides, and a picture of one of his weekly cabinet meetings. So the last issue is Eisenhower's embrace of innovation and technology. As commander of the Allied forces, this was an absolute necessity in order to win the war. You had to embrace new methods of trying to gain intelligence, new methods of military technology in order to win, of course. As president, he didn't stop being interested or investing in innovation and technology. He knew that it was critical to trying to maintain momentum in the Cold War, but it was also critical for domestic issues and to domestically continue to excel as an economy and as a nation. One of Eisenhower's big projects, of course, was the Interstate Highway System. Eisenhower had done a tour across country prior to World War II with a number of military trucks, and it had taken them 2 months to go from the East Coast to the West Coast because there were no properly connecting roads. They were in different states of disaster and array, and so it was incredibly challenging to get from point A to point B, which he knew was terrible for trade and for commerce and for communication, and if it was necessary for defense, how are you going to get tanks from point A to point B? And so he also knew that states were not going to come together to do this because they were going to squabble over who was going to pay for it and who was going to be responsible for it. So he knew it had to be a federal issue. But Eisenhower was also a stickler for having a balanced budget. He was not going to blow up the debt in order to make this happen. And so they agreed to increase a gas tax, and the gas tax paid for the implementation and the existence of the interstate highway system, and is one of Eisenhower's greatest legacies because most of these highways still exist and are still run by the federal government. So I've talked a lot about positive innovation. I'm going to continue to talk about positive innovation. There's one innovation that I think we have to grapple with as a legacy that's both positive and perhaps negative. Eisenhower really embraced the CIA and covert operations and covert intelligence. And he believed it was a very important part of warfare. It was a very important part of being a member of an international community, especially during the Cold War. And it was just what needed to happen. I think there are good arguments that he was right. There are also arguments that that sort of intelligence, those sorts of operations need more public surveillance and oversight than perhaps they had. And many of the operations were incredibly successful, but many caused a great amount of disruption in local areas and a great amount of anti-American sentiment that we're still dealing with in the 21st century. One of Eisenhower's biggest legacies is that he created, I would argue, he created sort of the world for the rest of the 20th century and into the 21st. And the role of the CIA and the role of intelligence and the role of covert operations is something that I think we all still debate and struggle with, and I'm not sure we have the right answer or a good answer, but it is something we have to acknowledge as coming from this period of time. And lastly, of course, as Don said, President Eisenhower was the first president to use the helicopter during his presidency. He loved that it was so convenient that it could pick him up from the White House and it could take him up to Gettysburg or take him to Camp David, take him somewhere else he needed to go. We didn't have to go up to Andrews Air Force Base or sit in traffic. He liked that he could have a great view, and he also used it for a number of diplomatic purposes as well. Not everyone was as comfortable flying in the helicopter as Eisenhower was, and they certainly weren't always comfortable when he was flying it. And he took lessons. He figured out how to fly it, and he would fly it to Camp David. He would fly it to Gettysburg. Mamie refused to fly in the helicopter when he was captaining it. She would go in the car. But so he used it for diplomatic purposes. This is a picture with him and Churchill. Churchill went with him to Gettysburg and to Camp David. But when Nikita Khrushchev came to the White House and sort of famously gave him a little trinket that had come from the latest Soviet satellite as the ultimate sort of snub gift in the Oval Office, Eisenhower's response is to say, okay, let's go in the helicopter. And they went on a spontaneous impromptu helicopter ride and took him around DC so he could see all of the sights. And he reportedly wasn't quite as comfortable with it as Eisenhower was. So again, this kind of just shows, I think, a great sense of humor, a flexibility in spirit, and a willingness to sort of use whatever tools you have at your disposal. So in honor of Eisenhower's use of the helicopter, we created this ornament, and it symbolizes a number of different elements of Eisenhower's presidency. He was very concerned about showing any sort of impartiality for the Army. And at the time, the Army and the Marine Corps both had a helicopter that he used. So he would alternate. And one day he would do the Marine Corps, and the next day he would do the Army. And he would go back and forth until eventually the Marine Corps took over that element of presidential transportation. So rather than having one branch's seal on the helicopter, we have the presidential seal. And then we also have the 5 stars on the other side for his rank as general when he was the commander of Allied forces. And it has been so much fun this year to learn more about Eisenhower as we honor him. The White House Historical Association does an ornament every year. We've been going in order, so started with Washington and worked our way up. And so this is Eisenhower's year, and I think it's one of my favorites. One, because the top actually does spin, which I think is a fun little element. But he is a very easy president to talk about. He's a little bit easier than, say, like a Hoover or Chester Arthur. No, of course, disrespect intended to either of those presidents, but he's an easy president to talk about and an easy one to learn about. So it's been great fun to learn about him and to be able to share a little bit with you today and to be here on behalf of the association. And so thank you again for being here, and I look forward to your questions.
Eisenhower and Truman are among my very favorite presidents. What was the basis of the animosity between them?
It's a great question. So initially, Truman he respected Eisenhower a great deal. He was hard not to respect. And he really wanted Eisenhower to run as a Democrat and tried really, really hard to get him to run as a Democrat and said, I'll basically stand aside if you can promise me that you'll run in my place. And Eisenhower said no. He had never been outwardly political. He had never run for office or in any way indicated his party, but the way that he viewed the world was definitely more in line with the Republican Party at that time. So he said no. So that was the first sort of strike. Then when he was campaigning, he was sort of outwardly antagonistic towards Truman. He had to distance himself from the current administration, which he had sort of fought and taken orders for. And he had been the head of NATO before deciding to run for office. And so he had to distance himself and create a party platform, and so used Truman as his foil and was pretty critical. And then the last element was during his campaign, Eisenhower elected not to criticize McCarthy, who was at the time a senator, and he was sort of on his Red Scare rampage trying to find communists both within the government and then eventually within the army. And McCarthy had been very critical of General Marshall, who Truman adored. And Eisenhower decided not to say anything about that, and Truman took that as a personal affront. So those sort of three reasons, I think, were the big reason they disliked each other. I think there's one up here.
What were some of the more unexpected things that your research told you about Eisenhower?
Well, so his sense of humor was one that I was not anticipating. We think of him sort of in this way when we look at a presidential portrait. And so he seems, older and maybe a little bit more serious. So I wasn't anticipating his sense of humor, his sort of joie de vivre. He loved playing poker and had to stop occasionally because he was winning so much money from his fellow officers that they were getting really angry with him. So just little elements like that. One of my favorite things about studying presidents is learning their very human qualities. learning their failures, learning their challenges, the things that they really struggled with. My heart broke when I learned about his response when he lost his first son, and how he sent flowers to Mamie on their son's birthday every year until he died, because they both lived with that pain. So things like that are my favorite elements to learn, but probably both like the sneaky, devious side, but then also the really sweet side.
This doesn't have anything to do particularly with Eisenhower, but I'm one of the volunteers from Kansas who was selected last year to decorate the White House for Christmas. And if you've never been to the White House, I encourage you to fill out an online application in August, and somewhere in October you will get an email from the White House and you've been selected. And it's an unforgettable experience, and I encourage. It was on my bucket list, by the way, and dreams do come true. So thank you.
Yeah, if you haven't had the opportunity to get to the White House, I would encourage you to do so. I think that it gives you a much better perspective of the history of the space when you can actually walk through it and see how it's evolved and see what still remains. I mean, not much remains from initially because it was burned, but there are some things that have been brought back. And so the history of the space, I really think, helps bring it to life as the people's house and as a historical place, not just as a home for the president.
I'm just curious about your organization. Could you say a little bit about it and what your mandate is?
Sure. So we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. We were founded in 1961 by First Lady Jackie Kennedy. And at that time, prior to the founding, there was really no mandate or requirement for presidents and first ladies to preserve anything in the White House. If they wanted to get rid of whatever was there, they could. And so some were more historically minded than others, but you could also just have a garage sale and basically get rid of whatever was in the White House. And so Jackie's vision was to make it a American museum to American history and art and culture, and bring back the historical elements of the White House and all of this amazing things that had happened in it prior to her being there. And so that is really sort of the initial vision. And the association supports and funds and protects and shares the history of the space and the people who have lived in it and worked in it and built the space. So we do everything from when there's a new set of state china, usually the presidents in their second term, they get a set of state china. The White House Historical Association pays for the state china. If something in one of the historic staterooms needs repair, so the Red Room is the famous Red Room, its walls are actually lined with red silk as opposed to paint. And there was a section of the red silk that was getting direct sunlight every day. It was quite faded, it looked pink. So we went in and had it replaced with the historic silk. So that's sort of our preservation component. From an education component, we have teacher institutes every summer where we bring in teachers from all over the country, and they're in Washington, D.C. for a week. They go to different sites. They go to the Library of Congress, they go to the White House, they go to the diplomatic reception rooms at the State Department. They hear lectures from all sorts of different specialists. They get a ton of resources on all these different aspects of White House history. And then they take them home and they can incorporate them in their classrooms and share them with other teachers. We write and we research lots of different elements of White House history and share that online in a variety of different venues. We also have the journal. There's a quarterly journal that comes out that has articles from scholars in every single possible subject you can imagine. And one of our new initiatives that we're working on is called Slavery in the President's Neighborhood. So First Lady Michelle Obama a couple of years ago said that every day she wakes up in a house that was built by slaves, and our website crashed because people were looking for information on the subject. And so there's actually not a whole lot known about the people who built the White House and then some of the enslaved people who worked in the White House for the first several presidents. And so we are doing a lot of research to try and bring back these stories and learn more about them, and then publicize them in articles online and share them with the public so that these stories are more well known. So we do a lot of different things, and are always expanding, always trying to do more, always working with new partnerships and new organizations such as the Eisenhower Library and universities. And although we have been around since 1961, we've really in the past 5 years expanded. So it's constantly evolving, and therefore every day is a little bit different.
I took the microphone from Pam because I wanted you to know that we actually still do send Mamie flowers.
Oh, that's really nice. That's really sweet.
We have, in the place of meditation, not only Ike and Mamie are buried there, but their firstborn son, and so
Wonderful.
flowers are placed there.
Yeah, my question is, you talked about the interstate system.
Mm-hmm.
How big of a fight was that to get the states to accept that? And
Getting the states to accept it wasn't really the big fight. The big fight initially was funding, because Eisenhower was insistent that it not blow up the budget and not create a huge deficit, but he also didn't want to cut spending from like the Department of Defense. And so it was a matter of finding a new source of funding. And at the time, a lot of people don't know this, the highest tax bracket during Eisenhower's presidency was 91%. So, I mean, obviously that was like the very, 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 very tippy top tax percentage, but he was okay with that because the economy was doing really well, and it was doing really well across the entire span of the economy. So it wasn't just the very top 1%, it was the middle class was expanding, and business was doing really well, and so the economy was doing great. And he was willing to keep that tax percentage in place because it was so important to him to have a balanced budget and to not have a deficit. And so the initial fight was, where does the funding come from? And when they came up with the concept of having a slightly higher tax on gas that would pay for, and some tolls, of course, that would cover those costs, then that basically sealed the deal.
I'm wondering, what do you see now when you go on the tour of the White House? When I did it in the 60s, I was very disappointed. It took just a few minutes and we saw almost nothing.
So now when you go, it absolutely takes more than a few minutes because you have to spend a little bit of time with security. You go through you have an ID check, then another ID check, then a metal detector check, then a dog, one of the bomb sniffing dogs, basically is behind a screen and has to smell you, and then you're in. And you can't bring anything. So like I have people come with me that bring purses, and you cannot bring in a purse. You can only bring in your little entrance papers and your ID and your phone and sunglasses. So once you get in, you come in through the East Wing, which is where the First Lady's offices are, and that was didn't initially exist when the White House was built. When John Adams first moved in November of 1800, that wing wasn't there. It was first added as a portico by Theodore Roosevelt in 1902, and then it was built out during World War II, and there was actually a bunker underneath. Now it's been taken over by the First Lady's office. So you'll come in that space, you'll walk down the entrance hall where there are a lot of really lovely photographs of different state visits and pets and celebrities and anything you can possibly imagine that's happened at the White House. There's the family theaters in that space, and then there's a little gift shop. Then you can go along the basement, which has the China room and the Vermeer room and the library, which is where usually presidents and first ladies, if they're doing some sort of address that's not like a formal press thing, but more like an interview, it usually takes place in the library. Then you go upstairs and you walk through the staterooms, and that is the East Room, which is the super big reception space. Then the Green Room, which was the first room that had its name. Then the Blue Room, then the Red Room, then the State Dining Room. And then the entry hall where a lot of the current presidential portraits are. And until Jackie Kennedy started bringing in some of these things, they were just rooms. they didn't have that many historic objects, they didn't really have that much art, and now they're really set up to be, they are in use. They are opened up for holiday parties or for events or for when the president is hosting someone. They feature sort of the range and depth of American art. So everything from different types of landscapes to show the different parts of the United States, to artists that represent different elements of society. So we have art by immigrants, we have art by African Americans, we have art by women and famous artists and presidential portraits and first ladies. And we have brought back in a lot of historic furniture that would have been there over time that was either in storage or has been purchased or donated and brought back in and then refurbished to show what it would have looked like. So two of my favorite examples, there is a tea set. There's this big tea urn that used to be, if you had people over for tea, you'd have this giant tea urn and there was like a little spigot, almost like we have for lemonade now. And it was John Adams, and he had it in the White House, and it says President's House. And it was brought back into the White House. So that sits in the green room. Another favorite is the Boulanger set of furniture that Monroe purchased from France after the White House had been burned. There was no furniture in it. And so he purchased a whole new set, and he had insisted that he wanted it to be mahogany because it was nice, but it wasn't too flashy. And the French artist that sent it over said, "You don't know what you're talking about. A president needs to have fancy furniture," and so it was gilded, and so all of the wood is covered with gold paint. And it recently underwent an unbelievable restoration, and it is so spectacular to look at. It almost looks fake when you look at it. You almost want to touch it, which I don't recommend doing. But so there's a lot of really amazing things to see now. You obviously can't see the private quarters or the upstairs or the family dining room, unfortunately, anymore. But there's a lot to see now. And an interesting sort of behind-the-scenes little fact about those rooms, when they are in use, a lot of times the curators they have to be very mindful of preserving these items. They want them to be open to the public, they want them to be accessible, but they have to protect them. So some of the couches really aren't safe for larger people to sit on, and so when sometimes when college teams come to visit the White House and linebackers are going to sit on the furniture, they swap out the couches so that they look very similar, but they're just not the originals, so that they can sit on the furniture and they won't break them.
Any unique changes, decorations, lasting imprints that either Mamie or Ike made to the White House, and maybe some unique things that Ike had in the Oval Office, anything that sticks in your mind?
Sure. So there's a children's garden out in back, and so of course either children or grandchildren can leave their handprints in little stones in the children's garden. So his grandchildren have stones out in the children's garden, which is really lovely. I should have included this picture. I thought I did, but there's a great picture of him grilling on top of the White House. There's a little veranda. It used to have a glass house, but it was not safe for the weight of the glass house. And so there's a great picture of him grilling up there. So the addition of a grill on top of the White House was certainly Eisenhower's doing. Many of the sort of personal decoration changes that they put in themselves no longer exist. So when they moved in, Bess and Harry Truman, they didn't sleep in the same bedrooms. And Bess had been in this little room off of the main sitting room. And Mamie said that it was like a closet and she hated it. And so after one night, she said, "I'm not doing it again." And took over the sitting room on the second floor and brought in a giant pink upholstered bed because pink was her favorite color, and so that became their bedroom. It's no longer the president's bedroom, it's back to being a sitting room again. But a lot of those sort of decorative changes were eliminated when the Kennedys came in. And in the private quarters, each president pretty much has the right to do what they want on the second floor. There's some objects that sort of have the protective seal of the association because, like the Lincoln bed, you're not going to throw away the Lincoln bed. But in terms of their own personal taste, what they want in that space. And usually those plans and what that looks like are not released until they leave office for security and privacy reasons.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Lindsay.
Thank you all for being here. This was great fun, and I look forward to doing a little bit of touring and seeing the museum and the library, and I appreciate your undivided attention.